This is the image they tried to bury. 5 corporate logos, 5 American giants, their names stripped from office towers in Houston and Detroit and Charlotte, now being bolted onto gleaming new headquarters in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. As of 6:00 a.m. this morning, Wednesday, February 25, 2026, the largest corporate exodus in North American history is officially underway. For the first time since the War of 1812, American economic power is physically migrating across the northern border, and this time, nobody fired a shot. The companies did it voluntarily. We are talking about $78 billion in combined market capitalization. We are talking about 43,000 American jobs. We are talking about 5 Fortune 500 companies that looked at the United States of America, the most powerful economy on earth, and said, "No, thank you. We would rather do business in Canada." This is not a relocation. This is a repudiation. And it happened faster than anyone thought possible. President Trump, already reeling from the Japan bond crisis, the wipeout polls, and the ongoing constitutional standoff with New York State over his personal assets, woke up this morning to the worst economic headline of his presidency. The White House is in full panic mode. Sources inside the West Wing describe the atmosphere as apocalyptic. The president is reportedly demanding emergency executive orders to block the departures, threatening to invoke the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to freeze corporate assets, and screaming at his trade advisor about tariffs that were supposed to bring companies home, not drive them north. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly which companies are leaving and why. We are going to explain the financial mechanics of a corporate inversion exodus. We are going to show you why Canada engineered the most devastating economic ambush since OPEC. And we are going to answer the question that nobody in Washington wants to ask: is this the beginning of the end of American economic supremacy? Buckle up. The empire is hemorrhaging. To understand why 5 CEOs made the most radical decision in American corporate history this week, you have to understand what happened over the last 18 months. It starts with the tariffs. In late 2025, the Trump administration imposed a sweeping new tariff regime on Canadian imports, a 25% blanket duty on everything from lumber to aluminum to auto parts. The stated goal was to punish Canada for what the president called unfair trade practices and to force a renegotiation of the USMCA. But here is what the administration did not anticipate. Canada did not fold, Canada retaliated, and then Canada did something far more dangerous than retaliation. Canada recruited. According to leaked documents obtained by the Financial Times, the Canadian government launched a classified initiative called Project Magnet in September 2025. The program, run jointly by Innovation Canada and the Department of Finance, offered a staggering package of incentives to American corporations willing to relocate their headquarters north of the border. We are talking about a 12.5% corporate tax rate for the first 10 years compared to the effective 21% in the United States. We are talking about zero tariff exposure to the European Union through Canada's CETA trade agreement. We are talking about expedited immigration visas for up to 5,000 employees per company. We are talking about subsidized commercial real estate in designated economic zones in Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Calgary, and Ottawa. The total value of the incentive package, according to sources at the Canadian Finance Ministry, exceeded $14 billion in combined tax breaks, grants, and infrastructure commitments. This was not a suggestion. This was a hostile economic recruitment operation designed to exploit the exact vulnerabilities created by American trade policy. Let us name the companies because the specifics matter more than the narrative. Target 1, Stellantis North America. The automaker, already furious over the 25% tariffs on Canadian-made parts that feed its Detroit assembly lines, announced Tuesday that it would relocate its North American headquarters from Auburn Hills, Michigan to Windsor, Ontario. The irony is staggering. Windsor is literally across the river from Detroit. Stellantis employees will be able to see their old offices from the new ones. The move affects 8,200 jobs and approximately $19 billion in market capitalization. The CEO reportedly told the board that the tariff math was simple. Staying in America costs $2.3 billion a year in duties. Moving to Canada saves $1.8 billion and opens tariff-free access to the EU market. Target 2, Dow Chemical. The Midland, Michigan-based chemical giant is relocating to Sarnia, Ontario, just across the border from Port Huron. Dow's exposure to the tariffs was catastrophic, $740 million annually on cross-border chemical shipments alone. Canada offered Dow a dedicated chemical processing corridor with subsidized energy costs from Ontario Hydro. The move encompasses 6,400 jobs and $38 billion in market cap. A source inside Dow's C-White told Reuters the decision was unanimous among the board. The quote, according to the report, was devastating. The American regulatory and tariff environment has become hostile to chemical manufacturing. That is not a Democrat saying that. That is the board of Dow Chemical. Target 3, Magna International's U.S. division. Magna, originally Canadian, had expanded massively into the United States over the past 2 decades. Now it is pulling its 11,000 American employees back across the border, consolidating operations in Aurora, Ontario. This represents $9 billion in relocated economic activity. Target 4, Nutrien, the world's largest fertilizer company, is moving its American operations hub from Deerfield, Illinois, to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, taking 4,200 jobs and $7 billion in associated activity with it. Target 5, Brookfield Asset Management is relocating its New York City office, the jewel of its American presence, to its original Toronto headquarters, pulling $5 billion in assets under management oversight back to Bay Street. 5 companies, 5 exits, 5 holes in the American economic fabric that will not stitch themselves shut. But here is the catch that nobody is talking about. These 5 companies are just the first wave. According to a confidential survey conducted by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and leaked to Bloomberg on Tuesday night, 23 additional Fortune 500 companies have active relocation studies underway. 23. The survey indicates that companies in automotive, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, and agribusiness are all evaluating Canadian, Mexican, and even European alternatives. The Chamber's own internal memo described the situation as a corporate confidence crisis of unprecedented scale. The data shows that CEO confidence in U.S. trade policy has fallen to 22%, the lowest reading since the index was created in 1987. That number should terrify you more than any headline. Let me explain the financial mechanics of what happens when a company of this size relocates its headquarters. Because this is not just about changing the address on the letterhead. When Stellantis moves to Windsor, every subsidiary, every holding company, every intellectual property portfolio gets restructured under Canadian corporate law. Transfer pricing, the way multinational companies allocate profits between countries, shifts entirely. Revenue that was taxable in the United States at 21% is now taxable in Canada at 12.5%. The U.S. Treasury loses that revenue permanently. Multiply this across 5 companies, and the Congressional Budget Office preliminary estimate released just hours ago projects a $12.4 billion annual loss in federal tax revenue. That is $12.4 billion every single year that will not fund Social Security, will not fund Medicare, will not fund defense spending. It comes directly out of the pockets of American taxpayers who stayed. It gets worse. The secondary effects are where the real carnage lives. When Dow Chemical leaves Midland, Michigan, the local economy does not just suffer, it collapses. Midland has 42,000 residents. Dow is the largest employer, the largest taxpayer, and the largest donor to the school system, the hospital, and the civic infrastructure. Sources at the Midland County government say they are projecting a 34% decline in property tax revenue within 18 months. The schools will lose funding. The hospital will lose its anchor tenant insurance pool. The restaurants, the dry cleaners, the car dealerships that serve Dow employees will see their revenue evaporate overnight. This is not an abstraction. This is the death of a town. And the same pattern repeats in Auburn Hills when Stellantis leaves, in Deerfield when Nutrien leaves. We are talking about entire communities built around these corporate anchors being gutted in real time. The Brookings Institution released a flash analysis this morning, estimating that the total secondary economic impact of the 5 relocations exceeds $31 billion when you factor in supply chain disruption, reduced consumer spending, and declining property values in affected regions. And here is what makes this a national security crisis, not just an economic one. Nobody on cable news is discussing this angle. Dow Chemical manufactures precursor chemicals used in defense applications. Stellantis builds vehicles under military contracts. Nutrien controls 22% of the North American fertilizer supply, and fertilizer is the foundation of the food chain. When these companies move their headquarters and their decision-making infrastructure to Canada, the United States loses leverage over their strategic priorities. A Canadian-headquartered company answers to Canadian regulators, Canadian courts, and ultimately Canadian national interests. The Pentagon is reportedly alarmed. A leaked memo from the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition describes the Dow relocation as a potential vulnerability in the defense industrial base that requires immediate interagency review. Now let us talk about the White House response, because this is where the situation escalates from economic crisis to constitutional confrontation. Sources inside the administration say the president convened an emergency meeting of the National Economic Council at 4 a.m. this morning. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By 7:00 a.m., the president had reportedly overruled every economist in the room. He demanded that his attorneys find a legal mechanism to physically prevent these companies from leaving American soil. He floated invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, EA, the same statute used to freeze the assets of terrorist organizations and hostile foreign states to block American corporations from relocating to a NATO ally. Let that sink in for a moment. The President of the United States is considering using anti-terrorism financial weapons against American companies for the crime of making a business decision. Legal scholars across the political spectrum are calling this insane. EA requires a declared national emergency based on an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security or economy of the United States. Corporate relocation to Canada does not meet that threshold under any reasonable interpretation of the statute, but reason has left the building. The West Wing is operating in pure survival mode. Every economic indicator is flashing red simultaneously. The Japan crisis has cratered the bond market. The stock market has shed $4.2 trillion in value over the past 3 weeks. The dollar index has fallen 8% since December. Consumer confidence hit a 14-year low on Monday, and now the corporate exodus is accelerating the bleeding faster than anyone can apply pressure. Here is the hidden connection that ties all of this together, and it is the thing the mainstream media has completely missed. The Japan bond crash and the corporate exodus are not separate crises. They are the same crisis expressing itself through different channels. When Japan's bond market imploded, it triggered a global repricing of risk. Interest rates spiked worldwide. The cost of borrowing in the United States jumped 180 basis points in 2 weeks. For capital-intensive companies like Dow and Stellantis, that spike in borrowing costs made the tariff burden unbearable. They were already hemorrhaging from the tariffs. The interest rate spike was the tourniquet being ripped off the wound. Canada, meanwhile, was running a counter-cyclical monetary policy. The Bank of Canada cut rates by 50 basis points in January, while the Federal Reserve was forced to hold steady. That interest rate differential, combined with the tax incentives from Project Magnet, created a gravitational pull that no fiduciary-bound CEO could resist. The math was merciless. Stay in America. 21% tax rate, 25% tariff exposure, 6.8% borrowing costs. Move to Canada. 12.5% tax rate, 0 EU tariffs through CETA, 4.1% borrowing costs. Over a 5-year horizon, the savings for a company like Dow exceed $9 billion. $9 billion. No board of directors on Earth leaves $9 billion on the table to satisfy presidential ego. That is not patriotism. That is malpractice. Let us push the scenario to the extreme, because the worst case is not 5 companies leaving. The worst case is a cascade. According to modeling by Goldman Sachs, which was circulated to institutional clients Monday evening, a full-scale corporate exodus of 25 to 30 Fortune 500 companies would trigger what their analysts call a cascading tax-base erosion event. Federal tax revenue would decline by an estimated $48 billion annually. State tax revenues in affected jurisdictions would collapse by a combined $22 billion. The dollar, already weakened by the Japan crisis, would face sustained selling pressure as corporate cash flows redirect to Canadian and European banks. Goldman's most alarming projection, a 15% decline in the S&P 500 over 6 months as institutional investors reprick American corporate earnings downward. Your 401k, your pension fund, your retirement savings would take another devastating hit on top of the Japan losses that have already wiped 11% off most portfolios. The report concludes with a phrase that has been circulating on Wall Street trading floors since Tuesday morning. Capital has no patriotism. It goes where the math works. And right now, the math does not work in America. What does this look like from Ottawa? From Prime Minister Mark Carney's perspective, this is the greatest economic victory in Canadian history. a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, a man who spent his career understanding the physics of capital flows. Carney designed Project Magnet as a precision instrument. He understood that Trump's tariffs created a pressure differential between the two economies, and he built a pipeline to exploit that differential with surgical precision. Sources inside the Prime Minister's office describe the mood as restrained but deeply triumphant. Carney reportedly told his cabinet that Canada did not steal these companies. America pushed them away. We simply held the door open and turned on the lights. From Beijing, the view is different, but equally damaging to American prestige. Chinese state media is running the corporate exodus as front-page news. The subtext is unmistakable. If America's own companies do not trust American economic policy, why should any foreign investor? The projection of economic power requires the projection of economic stability. The moving trucks parked outside Dow headquarters in Midland, Michigan, are a billboard advertising American decline to every government and sovereign wealth fund on Earth. How does this play with the base? This is the fracture point, and it is uglier than anyone in the White House wants to admit. The MAGA faithful are split down the middle. Half see this as proof that corporate America was never loyal, that globalist CEOs will always chase the lowest tax rate, and that Trump was right to fight them with tariffs in the first place. Betrayal by the elites, classic populist narrative. But the other half, the union workers in Auburn Hills, the chemical plant operators in Midland, the fertilizer technicians in Deerfield, they are watching their jobs leave the country under a president who swore on the campaign trail that he would bring jobs back. That is not a liberal talking point. That is their Tuesday morning. They voted for economic nationalism. They got economic exile. The populist coalition that carried Trump to victory in 2024 was built on the promise that American workers would come first. When 43,000 of those workers get relocation packages to move to Canada or pink slips because they cannot cross the border, the coalition does not just crack. It hemorrhages from the center. History teaches us that economic power, once it begins to migrate, does not reverse easily. When British manufacturing began relocating to the American colonies in the late 18th century, Parliament tried tariffs, restrictions, and outright export bans on machinery and skilled workers. It did not work. Capital found a way. When American manufacturing began shifting to Asia in the 1980s and 1990s, promises of protectionism and trade wars filled the political air. The jobs still left. When Irish tax policy lured American pharmaceutical companies to Dublin in the 2000s, Washington complained but never countered with competitive policy. The pattern is ancient, and it is merciless. Economic gravity pulls capital toward the environment of least resistance. And right now, Canada has engineered that environment with surgical precision using America's own tariff policy as the catalyst. The founders of this republic understood something fundamental about the relationship between commerce and sovereignty. Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist No. 12, argued that the prosperity of commerce is the most useful as well as the most productive source of national wealth. He understood perhaps more clearly than any founder that a nation's strength derives not from its military alone, but from the productive energy of its commercial enterprise. When that enterprise leaves, the strength leaves with it. The tax base shrinks. The innovation ecosystem withers. The talent follows the capital. This is the stress test, not of one president, not of one party, but of the American economic model itself. Can a country that imposes tariffs to protect its workers survive when those same tariffs drive the employers across the border? Can a nation maintain its global dominance when its own corporations voluntarily choose a foreign flag? We are in uncharted waters. The maps drawn in the era of American economic supremacy are useless now. The assumption that companies would always choose America, that American dominance was a law of nature as fixed as gravity, is being tested in real time, and the early results are catastrophic. As we head into Thursday, watch for three things. Watch for the White House executive order. Sources say the draft IEEPA order is being circulated among senior staff tonight, and the president is expected to sign something by Friday morning. If he invokes emergency powers to block corporate relocations, expect immediate legal challenges from the ACLU, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the companies themselves. The constitutional confrontation over whether a president can imprison capital within national borders will make the New York asset seizure look like a parking ticket. Watch the markets when they open tomorrow morning. Futures are already down 340 points as of this recording. Goldman Sachs has issued a sell recommendation on the entire U.S. industrial sector. If the sell-off accelerates past 500 points, the Federal Reserve may be forced into an emergency meeting, and their options are all terrible. Cut rates and risk stoking inflation that is already running at 4.7%. Hold rates and risk a recession. Raise rates and risk a depression. There is no good move left on the board, and watch Canada. Prime Minister Carney is scheduled to address the Canadian Parliament at 3 hours South PM EST tomorrow afternoon. Sources in Ottawa say he will announce the second phase of Project Magnet, a program specifically targeting American technology companies in Silicon Valley. If Google, Apple, or Microsoft begin making relocation noises, the $78 billion exodus we are talking about today will look like a rounding error compared to what comes next. The response from the White House will not be measured. It will not be a calm press conference with talking points and reassurances. It will be an executive order, or a trade war escalation, or a constitutional crisis, probably all three simultaneously, for the 43,000 American workers who just learned their companies are leaving. The moving trucks are already loaded. For the millions more watching from factory floors and office parks across the heartland, the uncertainty is just beginning. The tariffs were supposed to build a wall around the American economy to keep the jobs in and the competition out. Instead, they built a bridge to Canada, and the traffic is only flowing one direction. Subscribe. Stay tuned. The geography of American power is being redrawn in real time, and nobody in Washington has a map. The empire does not always fall to invaders. Sometimes it simply packs up, crosses the border, and never looks.